as we are expecting the U.S. later on this week, in fact, tomorrow, to announce new sanctions against Iran. A little bit more on this, as we do understand that is set to happen with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. This comes as Pakistan's army chief will visit Tehran tomorrow to continue efforts to bring peace and security to the region. That's according to Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson. Pakistan has taken on a mediator role in negotiations between Iran and the U.S. aimed at ending the war, which began back in February. Two Pakistani government sources did confirm that visit to Reuters. The second source saying that the talks would also address recent developments in the conflict, including President Trump's threat of tougher sanctions on Iran. Now, all of this comes amid heightened tensions as Iran threatens a military response to U.S. plans for sanctions that could put further a strain on the Islamic Republic's ailing economy. So these talks will coincide with an announcement tomorrow on details related to the planned sanctions, which the U.S. officials have said would be, quote, the toughest sanctions in history on Iran. President Trump warning of economic consequences against any country that provided any type of lifeline to Iran as he seeks to isolate the Islamic Republic. Now, oil shipments, of course, are continuing to be at a virtual standstill in the Strait of Hormuz, with Tehran threatening to strike any unauthorized oil tankers that try to transit this waterway. This also comes as Iran's economy is already under immense pressure from sanctions. To talk more on this, I do want to bring in Jonathan Ruhe, who is a JINSA Fellow for American Strategy. He has been following this war very closely. And Jonathan, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you so much for having me back. My pleasure.
So I do want to start off with the very latest announcement. We are expecting the U.S. to announce these sanctions tomorrow against Iran. And this really seems to be the strategy for now to really put the pressure on Iran's economy and seeing where that breaking point is. As we take a look at these new sanctions, what might we anticipate with this announcement tomorrow?
So I think there's a couple of things to look for, although I would add the caveat that the Trump administration certainly is capable of throwing curveballs at any given time. But I think in general, given the posture we've seen so far, you would expect maximum pressure in its latest form to really focus on clamping down on Iran's ability to export any energy, particularly overseas, given the blockade. But while the U.S. has its own direct sanctions on Iran, we've had those essentially since the Islamic Republic came into power more than 40 years ago. We're looking more at what are called secondary sanctions, which is going after companies in China, but also any other country that does business with Iran, essentially blacklisting them from the U.S. economy, imposing financial penalties, things like that. And I would say, you know, in looking at what I expect to hear tomorrow, I would go back to the first maximum pressure campaign the Trump administration put in place back in 2018, which essentially focused on driving Iran's revenue-generating exports down to zero through a lot of these similar measures. I think it's mostly going to be focused on that. But I would say, in addition, I'm hoping to hear that the United States will also mention the enforcement of UN snapback sanctions on Iran, which were put back in place last fall, given Iran's failures to comply with the nuclear deal. And those could actually have a lot of teeth to them. They could enforce essentially an embargo on anything Iran would want to rebuilding its military. And those have very strong enforcement authorities. And the United States could actually work together with a lot of our partners around the world to carry those out. So I'd hope to see those as well.
You know, Jonathan, you did bring up China. This comes as President Trump is expecting to welcome the Chinese president next month here in the United States. Now, Beijing buys a massive amount of sanctioned Iranian oil. You know, how does China factor into all of this? Because I have to imagine President Trump wants to be very strategic when it comes to that relationship and how that might be impacted.
Certainly, and I think Trump certainly has his hands full there, given that there's been a parallel trade war, whatever you want to call it, between the United States and China, where we saw in the past year that China actually has some serious cards to play, and even before that, even before Trump came back into office, China has essentially been the #1 violator of U.S. energy sanctions on Iran that have been in place in one form or another for more than a decade. So that's a very elaborate and difficult negotiation. And from the Chinese perspective, on the one hand, they certainly don't like the precedent of the major source of their oil exports being closed, being so uncertain, like we've seen in the Strait of Hormuz, partly because it increases China's dependence on Russia for hydrocarbons, and that's something China would like to avoid. So I think for President Trump, there is a way to play this intelligently and to basically say to the Chinese, we are going to finally crack down, enforce sanctions on your companies, which is something that's been subject of a lot of empty promises by a lot of presidents in the past. But the key question then is, where will the Chinese push back, and how should President Trump anticipate that? Because as we've seen, China has a lot of its own weapons that it's willing to wage in a trade war, and none of those directly have anything to do with Iran.
It's going to be very interesting to see how all of this plays out. You also mentioned isolating Iran's economy. When we take a look at this, because we're now entering into the 6th month of this conflict, just how fragile is Iran's economy at this point?
So, Iran's economy has in some way been fragile for decades, and sanctions are not the cause of that. They've they've worsened that situation, but ultimately, the main driver of Iran's economic fragility is the regime itself, because it's corrupt, it's unresponsive to its own people. It has failed in every basic test of what a government should do in terms of managing natural resources, having banks that don't collapse because they're run by regime cronies, having a currency that doesn't have constantly high inflation rates. So right now, I think a lot of the economic measures President Trump is threatening to enact could go pretty far to, in some sense, what we call breaking the Iranian economy, where inflation completely spirals out of control. They're unable to pay civil servants. They're unable to export anything that drives up revenues. We've heard statements from Iranian regime officials just in the past few days that their oil exports are now essentially zero. To be sure, the Iranian regime has adapted to U.S. sanctions over the years. They have a lot of muscle memory of how to avoid these things. And one of the reasons is because U.S. sanctions enforcement has always been spotty, even with the maximum pressure sanctions under the first Trump administration. So, I think Iran will do everything they can to try to minimize the impact of these sanctions. But that being said, the regime was already on a weak footing here even before this current war. The massive protests we saw in December and January were precipitated by a lot of these problems I described that were not caused by sanctions, namely the regime's corruption, brutality, and unresponsiveness. But I would also just add a note of caution here, which is if you just look at the economic indicators, inflation, revenues, things like that, the Iranian regime is in a very dire strait. And figures like the president and the Speaker of Parliament clearly want to get some sanctions relief now. They're willing to strike a deal like we saw in June. But I think their voices are outweighed by the true hardliners in Iran, a lot of IRGC officials who say, we don't care if the economy collapses. That's not going to compel us to change our hostility toward the United States. We think we won this war. We're not going to give in now, no matter the economic pain. And if the Iranian people go back out in the streets, we'll just mow them down again. We have no qualms about doing that.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Jonathan, I did want to share this with our viewers and to you. This is from Reuters saying that Trump said Iran was not ready to make the right deal as Washington weighs its next steps in the conflict, and Tehran warns of a, quote, devastating response to new U.S. threats. You were just mentioning that Iran really doesn't care about its own people and is willing to stick it out. What do you think would be that tipping point to put the right amount of pressure on Iran for them to capitulate and to be ready to make a right deal? Is that even in the realm of reality?
So it's within the realm of reality, but I think given the current situation, everything that's led to where we are now, unfortunately, it's not the most likely probability. Ultimately, the regime will come in back to talks under the general condition that they feel that this economic pressure is really starting to strangle them. But again, I think that would take a lot to get there because you'd have the more pragmatic, not moderate, but more pragmatic voices in Tehran try to win out over the hardline military folks. I don't see that as very likely. And ultimately, what we've seen is if you curtail Iran's military capabilities, and particularly their own ability to wage economic warfare in the Strait of Hormuz by militarily threatening to shut it down, that's really the key sort of variable here, the tipping point. Because right now, you mentioned Iran doesn't care about its own people. Trump is the president of an American democracy. He's the head of a party that doesn't currently like its outlook in the midterm elections, largely because of what the Iranian regime is doing to the global economy. And right now, Iran thinks, well, sure, the United States can inflict economic pain on us. We're willing to bear that because we won the war. Oh, and by the way, we think we can impose more pain economically on the United States by shutting off Hormuz. And that economic pain could more directly translate into political problems for President Trump and his party. That's at least the calculus the Iranian regime has. And until the United States concertedly addresses Iran's ability militarily to impose that pain on Hormuz, this current situation is going to continue getting worse for the United States.
All right, Jonathan Ruhe with JINSA, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you.